So one of the first things that I learned, almost one of the first things that I learned as I started my career was this acronym VUCA. Many of you would have come across this. It's volatile, it's unpredictable, it's complex, it's ambiguous. That is the state of the world that was defined with this term VUCA. This came to me, really hit home hard when we were a small startup, 2008, we were doing financial planning, wealth management. Some of the best things that could have happened to India had happened between 2004 to 2007, and then suddenly the great financial crisis strikes. Once that happens, you realize VUCA hits home really hard. But if I look back at life over the last 15 years, the fact that every year practically we have had something or the other which seems to have disturbed the normal ecosystem, whatever we may think as normal. Whether just after the GFC, when there was a large fiscal deficit and then we started having large inflationary bouts in India, then came the anti-corruption movements and the policy paralysis, then suddenly India was no longer in the sort of macroeconomic position that we currently envy India to be in. It was in fragile 5 because taper tantrum had happened. As we were getting out of that, demonetization happened, COVID happened, the war in Ukraine and Russia happened, and now we are all talking about tariffs, not even talking about things like AI, right? With so many changes taking place, there are every year, in some sense, there has been a year where we have seen that the world continues to remain VUCA. What do you do in a world which is as VUCA? You remain positive. I think one has to bring in a huge amount of positive intent to say that things will move on, and you need to have a strategic mindset. There was a conversation that have happened earlier today morning to say that we need to continue moving forward in light of all the complexities. Today, the whole conversation has been on saying, in spite of such large changes that are taking place in our macroeconomic situation, how is it that we remain stable? How is it that we move forward? How is it that we outcompete our competitors, gain market shares, continue to grow, and continue to work well for our customers? I think the big learning on that is data is your strategic ally. No surprises on that. And one of the things that I will talk about today is about external data. In many of the earlier sessions, you have seen and heard about how internal data is being used to make organizations a lot more efficient, a lot more effective, faster, smarter. What I want to talk about today is external data and how it can be an ally in a world which is fast changing. There is a small point about my startup. If I had a very crucial piece of information which was an external data point, maybe that is a startup that I would have continued to go on. In about 18 to 20 months of starting a financial planning startup, we had 100 crores of assets under advisory. We thought in a 3 lakh crore mutual fund industry, we are pittance, 3 basis points, who cares? Well, 15, 17 years later, 100 crore asset under advisory is still a very large number to talk about. That's a data point that never used to come out then. Since then, there has been a lot of industry data that has come out, regulators have begun to put out data, and in a sense, I've become a big votary of saying that data should be out there in the public domain, and we should all be harnessing a lot of that data for making better decisions for our organizations and for ourselves. Indeed, there is a very interesting case study that I'll talk about of what we did in the field of public policy. But before I go there, maybe a quick detour into saying why you should be listening to me, why you should think about data and external data and hear me. After the startup, I worked for one of the larger institutional equities houses. My job was to understand India in a sense where I could communicate to corporate India as well as to investors about what are the opportunity sets that are coming. The idea was to elevate conversations for fund managers, for chief investment officers, for CEOs of asset management firms, not to think about specific companies, but to think about how India is changing, what is changing in India, and what should we be thinking about? What is the big theme that they should be playing? Over 5, 6, 7 years, I ended up writing a large number of notes, and in writing those notes and reports, I looked at a large number of data sources. Frankly, there are very few government data sources, company data sources, new places from where you can poke out data that I had not scoured over the last 6, 7 years as I began to write about India. All of that ended up becoming my first book, The Making of India. It collects data and turns that into analysis and eventually into insight. And one of the key insights that that book talks about is that we all can have created opportunities for investors, for corporates, by addressing what I call the private cost of public failure. I'll let that sink in. It's the private cost that you and I as citizens pay because something in the public domain hasn't worked. And I'll think about this from three triplets, as I like to call them. Think about roti, kapda, makan. I can say, I know we've spoken about average age being 24 and early 20s, but I do see some people who are 40 and above. And many of you may remember standing in ration lines. At least I did. We've moved from a system where we are, in most cases, not dependent on the government. We still are. 800 million people still end up getting free food from government. But there is a large section of the population that is beginning to move away. Think about that in Bijli, Sadak, Pani. How do we think about private transport versus public transport? How do we think about having maybe an RO at our home and not relying on municipal tap water? How do we think about our shiksha? How do we think about our swasthya? And how do we think about suraksha, which could either be just living in a gated community for safety or saving for your own retirement and pensions? Across many of these dimensions where the government could or should have been a big player, we now have a situation where a large number of businesses are beginning to come in and offer these services to the aspiring Indian. Anyways, I wrote a lot about these things. My objective was, as I said, to write about investors, investments, talk to corporates, etc. But when you write a book, you never know where it ends up. It ended up with the Minister of State for Finance. I got an opportunity to go and work in the government. There was a thought to say that since I have some sense about how policy happens, if you write the word public in a basic thesis for yourself, there is an expectation that you understand how policy works. And then I took a significant career break, started working in the government of India. But that's where VUCA comes back and hits you again. While I decided to work with the Minister of State for Finance, he got moved to Ministry of Civil Aviation. That need not concern you, except that that became a very interesting data project, eventually one of the things that we will talk about here, and how we harnessed some very different types of data sets to come up and talk about what we have seen in the scheme of UDAN, the Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik. That's something that I'm going to talk to you about now. Now, 2016, 2017, the government of India has a scheme called the Regional Connectivity Scheme. The idea is that it is now becoming aspirational. India now wants to move forward, have a lot more airports. Indeed, many of the members of parliament that we would meet at the Ministry of Civil Aviation would say that a couple of generations ago, having a bus stop in the constituency was a big deal. 20 years ago, maybe in the parents' generation, it was about having a train and a stoppage of the train. That used to be a big demand that members of parliament would make to various ministries. And now they were coming to Ministry of Civil Aviation because what they were saying is, hey, we need airports, and not just airports, we need functional airports, we need air connectivity. In that backdrop is where the idea of the UDAN scheme was also coming up. When we began to formulate the scheme for UDAN, the question became, where do you expect this demand to come from? Now, there was this very interesting framework that Dilip ji mentioned in the morning today of being reactive, proactive, and literally shaping. One of the things that we started to do at the ministry was to try and get a sense that while the industry will bid for whichever routes they want to bid, what is it that we can bring to the table? Can we understand and anticipate where this demand is going to come in from? Now, the abstract idea of saying aspirational India and many cities that need to get connected is an important one. But how do you operationalize it? Which cities and which state governments and which airport authority person do you come in and tell them that, hey, maybe there is a possibility that this is where a new airport could get started or a new air connectivity could come in and get started? This is when we started working with Google. This is when we started working with Google. The bright idea here was that if we can identify where demand is, we can begin to prepare for where potentially the UDAN routes will begin to come up. Now, what is demand? Demand, as anybody from the economics world will tell you, is willingness to pay and ability to pay. Now, it's still very abstract. What is willingness and what is ability? When you want to understand willingness in a world before AI, when all of us would, the first thing that we would do is go to Google to try and understand what is happening. We started working with Google to try and understand how many of their search queries were transport related. Turns out around that time, about 15% of their India-based queries were transport related. Now, transport could mean going from Parel to Andheri, transport could mean going from Bombay to Delhi, but they had a way of trying to understand where the demand is coming in from, where is the person searching from, and what is it that the person is searching. Is he saying that he wants to go from Bombay to Raipur and parse the to and from? We ran a large number of iterations on that to try and narrow down to say what is it that could represent the air demand. What are large enough distances where people will go? We've done understanding to see that in India, the average length of air travel then was about 1,000 odd kilometers. Average train length was significantly lower. People would do only about 600-700 kilometers on an average by train. So we began to try and understand where is it that people could potentially fly. So the ability section of trying to understand and forecast where the demand will be began to come in from these search queries. Now, this is a completely different data set from what you would think anybody in civil aviation will want to use, because that's not naturally your course of business. A typical rule of thumb in industry, in aviation industry, would be you try and see what the OD pairs are, origin destination pairs are, see what people have booked, and if there is a hopping flights pattern that you can see that people have come from point A to B and gone to C, maybe there is a potential to go between A and C and create a direct flight there. But this was a completely tangential, different way of doing things. Okay, great. We now have a system where on an ongoing basis, we can understand the willingness of people to go from point A to point B, because that is the intent, that is the stated intent that they have looked at. How do you define ability to pay? Willingness to hai. Now, do the people have the ability? Because people in deep rural India could potentially still want to travel from point A to point B. Forget the infrastructure constraints, but do they have the ability to pay? One of the things that Google was anyways designing, and that's something that we worked very closely with them also around that time, is to develop almost a quasi HDI, a human development index sort of a thing. The idea was that if you have a situation where, if you look at Google Maps or the surroundings of what is happening in that lat long, and if it is a complex area, then potentially the willingness to pay there or the ability to pay there would be significantly higher. Now, what do I mean by a complex area? A place which, for example, let's say has a cancer research institution. What that means is around that there will be a larger number of supporting entities in that ecosystem that will support that institution and so on and so forth. We began to identify markers of saying where such complexity exists. Places which were simpler, we assumed that the incomes there will be lower, and that is how we started defining what would be the places where the ability to pay is also high. Now, once you have a layer of willingness to travel, people traveling from point A to point B, and on that you layer something about willingness to pay, you are able to now estimate demand. Now, this is something that's happening completely outside of the Airports Authority ecosystem or the aviation ecosystem, because we have now found a new or a very different way of identifying where demand could come in from. What we did is we put this on a map of India, identified 10 cities. This is 2016-17. Since then, a large number of these cities have obviously been connected with the UDAN scheme. The UDAN scheme has now increased the number of operational airports from 70 odd at that point in time to about 140. But this became an interesting tool for us to then go and talk to the industry and tell them that, hey, these are places where we began to see some amount of action from a completely different data set. And is this something that you want to think about? We could also then talk to the state governments, AAI, and tell them that, hey, this is where you can begin to expect demand. Now, as you work with some of these external data sets, we began doing a large number of other optimizations to see whether you should have a particular airport in a particular place, because whether will it cannibalize a parent airport, is there enough feed that could come to it, etc., etc. The idea that I want to leave you here with is to say that in any situation, there could be very, very different types of external data sets that you can bring to the table and start to make it very interesting and viable. And I will talk about some of the use cases that you could potentially think about as you go forward. What I want to do, though, is to pull together from this some of the learnings of what we learned as we were beginning to do this. I think first is very simply just find what the valuable data points are. There is an ocean of external data. As I said, when we started writing about India, there is just enough amount of data that was available even then, and I'm talking early 2010s. Now with Digital India and the huge amount of digital exhaust that is there, the sheer amount of data sets that are now available, and we'll talk about some of them as we go forward, is just very, very large. how is it that you identify what is valuable for you is important. In all of this, I think one of the most critical elements is to have something that someone I like to call a think partner. Someone who can sit with you and ideate and say, hey, this is where the data, one, can be sourced from, but more important, this is how it can be used, analyzed, visualized, and put into action. The think partner plays a very critical role. We heard in the Hindalco presentation also about this being a very iterative process. And I think that's very important, and you need to necessarily have a partner who can talk about and understand where the value of that data is coming in from. Second is creating the right models, whether it is the private cost of public failure point that we were talking about earlier, or here the willingness and ability to pay model, the ability to say what is it that you want the data to solve for, what is your framework, what is your model that will solve for this, how is that useful for your business is an important element. So that's the next step in some sense. So you have ideated, you have figured out what the data set is, what is the model that you make. Third, and I know this has been a session with a lot of technical inputs on it, the output for the team has to be comprehensible. People really don't want to know how many megaflops of data you have used, whether you have used a GPU, whether there is Claude, whether there is a lakehouse, etc., etc. What they basically want to know, the person on the field is, boss, is this airport opening or is this not opening in that case? Or in many of your cases, what is the action that I need to do? So just making comprehensible output for the team, converting from all the data that you have to an output that they can work on is, I think, very, very critical. And finally, having an adaptable process. And there was an interesting point that came up in the earlier presentation that Pankaj, Amitabh, George were talking about Sirius, the acronym that they had. And to say that everything needs to be repeatable. Build a model in a manner that once you have created that model, it continues to imbibe the data sources that you have thought about, works on that model, throws an output. If that output doesn't work, how do you make that process continues to run? How does it learn from the mistakes that it may have made or the advantages that it may have found out and becomes better? So finding the valuable data points, making usable frameworks and models, having comprehensible outputs for your team, and finally making an adaptable process. These are some of the things that we found valuable. I think two quick pro tips. One is the world changes. We started this conversation by saying everything is VUCA, things change. You want to identify, in this specific case, cities, but things can change. Urbanization patterns may begin to change. The local economic geography of a city may begin to change. Some other economic geography may start to become more prosperous, etc. The model has to have the ability to continuously take that into account, test your assumptions, and then give you that output. And finally, I think an important point which we have heard through the day is that this is all a team sport. You need to have all stakeholders together so that they understand what is going on. They have a buy-in into the model so that when that model is created, you're able to take it to fruition. Now, this is one project that we did. I just wanted to leave some ideas and thoughts behind for you to think about it from what I would like to call micro use cases potentially at ABG. There are some examples that I've taken. Not necessarily an expert in this field, but happy to talk more about this as we go ahead. Let's say we are still in the business of demand forecasting, something that we were trying to do for the UDAN airports. Where is it that the airports would come down? Demand forecasting by definition for data is, I think, one of the most critical, one of the most basic things that everybody wants to do. The demand forecasting is typically either a 1 month, a 1 week, 1 month, 1 quarter exercise, or could be very long-term type of an exercise also. Let's take a situation of saying that, hey, you want to plan your near term better. You want to know where are people constructing, what is happening, who is constructing what type of things, what are the sort of data sets that you could look at. We were discussing in one of the tea breaks that there was some conversation to say that can we begin to look at satellite data. Some of the things that we track very closely are permissionings and permits that people apply for. So at every municipal level, there is a permissioning that people have whenever they are trying to make any residential place or even a commercial place, etc. And so can you begin to track that? Is that something that gives you some insight and information? Can you see where stocking and destocking is happening? There is good enough external data to understand how are commodities moving from point A to point B. Who is moving those commodities? Can you begin to look at that and get a sense of, is your competitor stocking in a particular place? Are they not stocking in that particular place? Are they now beginning to find a new place where they are moving their commodities? Maybe that gives you a sense of at least what the competition is thinking about. Satellite points that we've mentioned about, can you see which towns are growing? More interestingly, and there is a work that we did when I was with the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund on toll roads, to try and understand, can you begin to get a sense of where the cities are expanding? Where are you seeing more passenger vehicles go through which toll plazas? That gives you a sense of maybe the city is expanding in that direction. There are different ways in which you can bring this to the table, test many of these hypotheses, and come back. Maybe you want to look at a more B2C type of a business. Let's say an e-commerce type of a business. Today, it's easy to track what type of SKUs are selling, what is happening to the product attributes, which product attributes are coming up on top, which are bestsellers on various e-commerce websites. What sort of pricing are they talking about? How has the pricing trend been? How has the packaging been? Are they selling smaller sachets? Are they selling bigger things? Are they selling in different types of packaging? A lot of this information is just out there, requires the ability to imagine this, seeing where you want to get this from, build this into part of your decision-making process and your strategy and optimization process. Global, we spoke again VUCA and we spoke tariffs. I think one of the most interesting things that we can now begin to do, especially in an AI world, is to understand what everybody else is doing. Mr. Vembu made a very interesting point about saying, can you use AI to summarize what Microsoft's results were to understand? Why stop at that? Have a tracker on each of your competitors, each of your members in the industry, upstream, downstream. Try to get a sense of what is it that they are saying. What are their 8Ks and 10Ks saying? What are their annual reports and MD&As saying? What is that strategy that they are beginning to talk about? Put that on markets, put that on policies. That becomes your AI tool which begins to empower at least your understanding of what is happening so that you are not spending time to try and understand each and every topic, but get a sense of stimuli from what your external world is doing and competition is doing. These are some ideas. Happy to discuss some of these more as we go forward. Similarly, cost optimization. Again, a very critical, interesting, important use case from a data perspective. I already spoke about commodity movement. Am I transporting commodity longer distances? Is it longer distances for particular geographies that I am sending this because maybe my plant is further away? Does a competitor have a better positioning simply because they have a nearer plant or they have a different, let's say, railroad ratio in the case of cement, bulky commodity? What is happening with respect to our network dynamics? A lot of this data, frankly, just sitting outside of the organization, there just exists enough amount of data for people to come and do strategy consulting with you. So if my friends at BCG are listening to this, maybe this is something that they should pick up. But a lot of this is just simply external data that many organizations sometimes don't end up harnessing because the focus ends up being, hey, this is data that I see on a daily basis. This is my internal data set. I can optimize this. I can make my team do this on the back of this. Thinking about external data is critical and important. I'll move this from the micro to the macro. India is expected to grow from the current $4 trillion economy to $10 trillion economy. How do you track many of these changes that are taking place? We spoke about urbanization in the passing. Will we end up having mega clusters, which is what China's growth model has been with respect to urbanization? Or will we have a large number of dispersed million-plus cities, maybe 100 million-plus cities? That has implications on how you think about your longer-term strategy. Where is it that you will have your outposts? Where is it that you will begin to put your teams and people there? What is happening to demographics? Again, with the amount of data that is now available, and frankly with user consent, especially for retail organizations, the ability to understand how your target market is changing has become dramatically large. Are young people coming into a particular geography? Are there older people moving in? Are people migrating away from point A to point B after a certain stage in life? A lot of these dynamics can be tracked externally. Easily doable, requires some thinking as to how do you bring it back into your business, but doable. I won't spend some time on this. I want to give you a sense of the sheer variety, and this is just a small list of either alternate data, financial data, market data that is available. A lot of this is, again, to use the Sirius framework, which is available on an ongoing basis. Some of this gets refreshed literally either by the second if it is a market data, maybe even microseconds. Financial and market data can tend to do that. Or on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, there is just a flood of data that comes in. Logistics, transport, export, import, down to the nth level of understanding what is happening at the HS 8-digit code, for example. Transport, again, literally at every 1400 RTOs, you can find out which is the different type of models that have been sold. Yesterday, we were speaking with one of the larger consulting companies again, And an interesting point came up about saying that the government is, I think, now trying to put GPS trackers on commercial vehicles. And one of the use cases was, hey, where were the commercial vehicles sold? Which are the RTOs which sold commercial vehicles over the last 5 years? Data is available. That's something that you need to think about that, hey, can I begin to harness this data? And in that journey, again, that think partner is a useful person. I won't go into the details of each of this. The idea here that I want to leave you with is that not only is more and more data coming in from more and more data sources, now you're beginning to get a lot of external data. And I think an important thing to think about is whether you are using that external data or not, either consultants or your competitors are definitely using that data. So this is time for you to begin to think about external data and bring it in. Since this has been an entire session on AI, I want to leave you with some of the frameworks that we are beginning to think about when we think about AI. Slightly busy chart, but let me go bottom up. There was an interesting point again which came up in the morning about saying that we don't want just brainstorming but question storming. And I think that's the perfect way to think about how you think about using an AI model. At the most basic is a factual or a retrieval question, almost like how you would use a Google search, which is to say, hey, tell me what is the current repo rate or give me a sense of top 50 companies or whatever it is, right? It's a very factual type of a conversation. Again, Mr. Vembu made this point. This is something that you would really want to get the AI to work on faster, quicker, easier to do. Then is descriptive, which is a point that we again discussed, which is to say, tell me what is my competition doing? How am I doing? What has my management gone out and said? What is it that maybe the regulator is saying? Some of those are again basic questions. Put that into your AI, make this part of your work stream after you have put in all the data pipes coming in into that AI. Those are questions that you should question storm with your AI. Then becomes a question of comparative. Again, we are beginning to find AI, especially if it has been given good quality data sets, underlying data sets, the ability to do analytical and comparative work is very, very high. Can you put down what is happening, the return on equity on two different companies? Can you break that down and tell me what is causing that increase in return on equity of one company versus other? Can you begin to tell me how I should think about what levers they may have pulled? This is where you're beginning to see a lot of use cases where question storming just one-on-one with AI can be very useful. It's not even necessarily a team sport now. Then it becomes a lot more team sport that you can begin to do. What is the creative generation that you can do with AI? Can you help me draft a pitch for the ESG focused mutual fund that we are doing? Maybe that is something that the capital group wants to put together here, right? Now, you won't leave it. Again, rightly as it was pointed out, this is not something that you now leave it completely to AI and this is an output that comes up. But is that now a conversation starter that 5 different people coming into the meeting room have thought about this question with AI, seeing what all your competitors are doing, what the regulator is saying, what the consumer surveys may be saying, etc., looked at it from different perspectives and then coming into a meeting, it's a very powerful conversation. As we begin to go up the step, the multi-step problem solving or context-dependent interactions, etc., that's where human in the loop obviously starts to become important. Who knows when the human will go out? I'm not betting on that anytime soon. But the idea is once you have pulled together all these data sets, all these things into your data lakehouse, the ability to then get AI to become your question partner, your brainstorming partner in a sense becomes very, very high. And I would encourage all of you, if you're not already doing this, this has to become like the next Google search for you. This is no longer a thing that a 24-year-old will come in and do it for me. That's now how the world will work. If for senior leaders this is not an imperative, this will not become culture. The senior leaders have to necessarily almost have an AI sparring partner. And that is something that I think bringing, and in some sense the role that the senior leadership obviously plays in any organization is to bring in that external stimuli. By definition, the younger folks will continue to work on internal data. They will have an understanding of what is happening in the wider ecosystem, in the markets, in the economy, etc. But it's the senior people who can ask the right set of questions to bring some of this thing to the table. So build in those external data pipelines, start using AI in a particular manner. And I want to leave you with this last slide. I started with VUCA. There was a reason I started with VUCA, that you now begin to think of VUCA in a slightly different manner. Think about how your data can be made more valuable. What valuable data do you bring to the table? How do you build usable models? How do you think about a comprehensible output? And how do you think about an adaptation process? Hopefully I've woken you up after the lunch thing. and taken you from a threatening world of VUCA to a more positive world of VUCA. With that, I'll pause. Happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, Akhilesh. In the interest of the time, we will take only 2 questions. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. This is a very insightful session. I'm Ashish from Ultratech. So we are trying to do something like geographical information system, the first page, that first slide that you showed. Now my questions are in 2 parts.
Yes.
Who should use that data? I mean, whom would you give that tool to use that? Because in the front line, people want to deliver, they want to act. So who should do this analysis for them? That is my first question.
Sure.
And the second question is, in the plethora of the data that is being provided from all the parts, which you can buy, which you can collect, which is available free of cost, which are the top 5 data sets or point of views which you can put over the layers of the map, which will be helpful for taking any decision in the building material industry?
Okay. I think the first question was already answered in the morning in a sense, and maybe I'm paraphrasing what Dilipji said about capital R and capital D being in 2 different places. I think the first question, the capital R of saying how do you research, how do you think about this data at a central level has to happen, because the zonal manager or the team, the sales team there, they simply don't care where you are getting this data from. They just want to be told that, hey, go to this locality or go to this person. They can give you feedback from what they are hearing. Is this data or is this model useful for them? Is it working out? Has their productivity gone up from whatever, 30% sales made to about 70% of the leads being right? The research has to happen at a central level. Again, going back to the UDAN conversation, this research could not have been done at Sambalpur, for example, right, which was one of the cities which came up. It had to happen at a central level. We could then go and talk to the local authorities there and say, hey, can you begin to get ready for this? Whether it will get picked up or not, who knows? But that's at least, so the capital R in some sense is a very central function. But then you let it go into the wider ecosystem, learn from that feedback and come back. On your second point, if I understood it right, what you were saying is, what are the 5 different tools that we can use on top of data?
5 point of views on a map. Maybe population, maybe where the construction is coming, where the towns are.
Understood. I wish I had a very simple answer. Sorry, I'll need to have slightly more context on the building materials thing. The basic thing that I would think about would be, again, okay, going back to the willingness and ability to pay percentage, right? If you can begin to figure out in a particular location whether there are enough customers, whether there is enough demand and willingness and ability, that could be different proxies. It's not necessarily only an income proxy. Maybe there is a substitute or a competitive thing that is there that can identify and that can tell you, hey, this thing is moving differently. I'll have to think along those dimensions. I don't have a rough cut 5 answers, but happy to be the think partner on that topic.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, at the back, here.
Yes.
So, a couple of things. One is you mentioned that there are a lot of data sources. My question is that some of them are public, some of them are privately owned. How is that accessible? Is there a place that you can access the data, for any organization? And secondly, a related question to that is, with the DPDPA now in the picture, how much of that data, even if I am able to acquire, first of all, can I acquire that? And even if I'm able to acquire it, can I put that into use?
So, I don't know if I can make a sales pitch. Okay. You can come to Thurro, which is a company that I've co-founded, for access to a lot of these data sets. Many of the points that you saw in that big slide where there was alternate data, etc. Something that we ensure that we collect from the right places, keep it to high quality, ensure that the pipeline is clean, you get the right quality of data, etc. I would want to believe that we are the best providers, but I'll leave it at that. There will be multiple places where you can begin to get data. A lot of this data is actually already freely available in the Digital India ecosystem, data.gov.in, a variety of state-level enterprises, entities, regulatory bodies, etc. are beginning to do that. I think the interesting thing is just ensuring that you know which data set you want to access, and hence sometimes it can become very large and cumbersome for every organization to start to maintain it. It's something that you can do with once you start to know that, hey, this is a data that I will continuously require. But ensure that the pipelines are tightly built, they are checked on a regular basis, the data is kept clean because things keep changing on an ongoing basis. You use a very interesting word about how can I own that data in a sense. I think the interesting thing to think about is how can you access that data. Ownership is a separate world altogether about data, and in a world where you begin to now conceptualize data as oil in a sense or as an asset, ownership has different connotations. Do you just have access to data for the time that you want to run your analysis? Do that analysis. Maybe that data itself is not of use to you because what you need is that output. So in many cases, what you need is actually access to data, maybe even a temporal access or a spatial access, some time, space access to that data, and then maybe you don't require it going forward. So I would think about the distinction between ownership and access. And your last question was, sorry, the second question was on?
DPDPA.
DPDP. A lot of external data is by definition not PII. The thing that DPDP is trying to do is to protect personally identifiable information, right? So PII is what you're worried about. This is external data. This is out there in the public domain. This is what has been emitted because there are entities which are online, because the regulator has put this thing out, because the government wants to put this thing out, because somebody can scrape your website. This is all non-PII information. You start getting into PII information largely when you start looking at information which is internal to you. Do you have the consent of your customer? Can you use his or her data for XYZ purposes? A lot of external data points that we are talking of is by definition DPDP compliant, and not just DPDP compliant. The other thing to keep in mind in many cases, especially if, and many of you are in listed entities, etc., is that this is public information. So this is not even unpublished price sensitive information, right? Because this is published in a manner of speaking. It is available. So both from trying to understand whether it is PII or UPSI, as you would call it in the SEBI parlance, external data is in some sense kosher to use for you. Of course, take legal advice, but those would be the broad points that I would make.
Thank you, Akhilesh.